I'm the Executive Director of Immigrant Advocates Response Collaborative. We are a legal service collaborative in New York. We're an organization focused on providing access to justice and access to counsel for immigrant New Yorkers. And I am also the daughter of two journalists, and so have been wanting to do this panel forever and ever and ever. And I'm so delighted that we're finally here tonight. The bios for our speakers are on our website, and starting tomorrow, you'll be able to find a recording of this event as well as additional resources on our website under the past events tab. And you can read the bios there as well as in our events page for tonight. But I do want to quickly introduce you, and I'm just going to go in order on my screen. So because all of you are important, of course, I want to introduce Liz Robbins, now with Define American, formerly with the New York Times, Mazen Sidahmed from founder of Documented New York and formerly of The Guardian, Eddie Taveras of Fore.us, and Crispin Hernandez from the Workers Center of Central New York, a longtime advocate. And I also want to thank my colleague, Myra Aldous-Deckert, for being here tonight and joining us to help with translation and interpretation. So we're going to launch into this panel. I think this topic is just so crucial right now because, as the quote says, right, journalism is the first rough draft of history. And right now we're living through some pretty unprecedented times, and we're sort of at a pivot time when it comes to immigration, and we're at a pivot time when it comes to how we're going to move forward, leaving the last many years behind. I don't even want to say the last 4 years, because the immigration system has been in crisis for a very, very long time. And we're just at a point where this stalemate has to end. And the reality is that to end the stalemate, we have to have a better conversation on immigration. And the role of the press and the role of the media plays such a critical role in that. We also and we didn't anticipate that the Derek Chauvin verdict would be last week, but we did want to put this conversation in the frame of the broader racial justice conversation happening in this country right now, because it so clearly ties into the decisions that are made in newsrooms and how we tell these stories of immigrant communities, particularly Black, Brown, API immigrant communities. And so we want to recognize that, and we hope that we address that tonight. So there is a chat. You're welcome to go ahead and type your questions in the chat box, or we also have a Q&A box. You can tie them in there. These are journalists. I wasn't going to try to tie them to, a 10-minute panel presentation and advocates. So the hope is that this will be a conversation, and the hope is that you will participate in that conversation. I, as the moderator, will be asking some questions, trying to guide the conversation along, trying to hit on some themes that we thought were important to discuss tonight. And I will also be keeping an eye on your questions so that we can weave them into the conversation. And we will leave a time at the end, of course, at about 5:45 for you to ask more pointed questions. So with that, let's jump in. And I think a really good place to start, and I'm going to direct this to Liz and Mazen, but again, I'd ask Eddie and Crispin to please, to please chime in if they have any thoughts. But what are some of the considerations when you choose what stories to report when you're working on immigration?
I'll start with that. Thanks so much, Camille. You and your organization, your army of lawyers, are really the reason that we were able to do, and I'm speaking for Mazen, and certainly I was able to report for the New York Times community city stories, because you had the clients and you had the experience and brought those stories to us and helped us interpret them. So thank you to you and IARC. And we are really at this very, as you said, definitive time right now. How do we transition from what happened of 400 plus policy changes and laws and regulations to what Biden is at least trying to do? So I think you first have to look, if you are covering anything in New York City or a smaller city, you have to look at what's happening nationally. So what are the regulations? What are the laws? What is the trend? And how does that impact your own community? And I think back, Camille, to the story, I do refer to it because it was a really seminal moment when the Trump administration and Jeff Sessions canceled DACA and said, you've got a month. If you have it now, you can renew it. And then once the renewal period was up, we discovered that there were people who sent in their applications. There were DACA recipients who sent in the renewals who somehow had them lost in the mail. And it started as a local story. We found about 38 people affected in New York, and then it got to be broader. We found out there were more people across Illinois. From what we thought of 38 people affected, we got their stories by connecting to certain lawyers. And then it was almost 2,000 people who had been rejected because the mail didn't arrive, which was the fault of the USCIS and also the US Postal Service. So this story was able to reverse the course. The government got such backlash saying, how can you do this? We've all had something lost in the mail, right? Something important. That changed it. So your organization was helpful in identifying people. So a national trend, of course, family separation, covered it from the New York perspective. But as journalists, we have to contend too, reporters contend with editors saying, well, why should we care? Are people going to actually click onto this? So yes, and they care because there are local stories that are surprising. Find something surprising that people don't know. And also, I guess the other consideration is there an event? Sadly, it may be a criminal event. You remember in New York, there was the nanny who was working at a Flushing birth center, and she stabbed people. She went on a rampage. She had kind of crossed, apparently, mentally. She was unwell. But so we profiled at the New York Times, we profiled that community. I think the goal of journalists in covering immigration is to provide nuance. So often we see the good immigrant and the bad immigrant trope. And it's not always that. The stories don't have to be the extraordinary immigrant or the downtrodden. There are people who live in this community, who live in around all over, who can basically go through the same things that we are as New Yorkers. And so we need to humanize people by telling their stories and by doing that accurately and responsibly.
Thank you, Liz. Mazen, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, sure. I would just agree with everything that Liz said, and that approach to journalism as well. And one of the things that we've been really focused on at Documented is making sure the people most affected by the stories are also the people reading our stories. So a lot of times immigration reporting, the protagonist in the story isn't really the intended reader. So we kind of wanted to break that cycle. So what we've been doing is using WhatsApp. We've set up a WhatsApp news service targeting Spanish speakers in the city, where we provide immigration news, information about city resources that people could access if they're undocumented in the city. And from that, we've developed a sort of conversation with a lot of undocumented Spanish speakers in New York. And they kind of act as editors almost in our newsroom, where they help drive our coverage and tell us what's important to them and the things that they would like to know about, either latest immigration policies, but more often local city policies that are really impacting them on a day-to-day. So we end up doing a lot of labor coverage about issues that are impacting immigrants, from wage theft to, bad employers, or, city policies that were intended to help undocumented immigrants, but have just gone sideways and aren't actually doing what they intended to do and set out to do in the first place. Yeah, that's really helped shape our coverage, and has made that we actually do a lot more service journalism than we thought we would be doing when we first founded Documented. We wanted to actually provide things that people would want to read and be helpful for them in their day-to-day lives. And what people told us they wanted was just, raw information about how you navigate this super complex bureaucracy in New York City. And it's been really rewarding, and it's helped us actually have an audience that we set out to have in the first place.
Mazen, if I can ask a quick question, what have you found from this type of reporting on WhatsApp? What kind of story would you get that perhaps another mainstream media outlet would not get? What's the advantage?
Yeah, so I think one of the best examples is probably our coverage of the OSF fund from last year. So a year ago, the Open Society Foundation gave New York City a $20 million gift to give direct payments to undocumented immigrants in New York City. Undocumented immigrants were banned from, prevented from accessing any of the federal stimulus packages that came out in the past year. So this was kind of met with huge fanfare, you know, that undocumented immigrants were going to have access to this funding. So people were messaging us all the time, being like, yeah, you know, the city was on this huge press tour. We're giving out this money, you know, apply for it. It's here to help you. So people were messaging us like, hey, how do I get access to this money? Like, I need it. I'm undocumented and I need it. So we thought, no big deal. We have a good relationship with the Mayor's Office of Immigration Affairs. We called them and we figured they would just tell us how people could apply. But they kept dodging our questions, kicking the can down the road,
Yep.
you know, avoiding us. So we thought that maybe there was a bit more to this. So we put a reporter on it to kind of figure out what was going on with the fund. And it turned out that the money had basically been pre-spent. And if you didn't have a relationship with these organizations that were handing out the money, doing good work, we just did another piece about how that all went down. But these people that were messaging us, they didn't know, and it wasn't being made clear to them that they never had a chance of getting any of this money unless they had pre-existing relationships with these organizations. And that in Spanish was our most read story of the year. You know, like it caused a big stir in the community, and you know, made the Mayor's Office of Immigration Affairs pretty unhappy. But that's the type of story that, you know, we looked at other outlets and they were just publishing straight news about the fund, whereas we actually had direct access and understanding from people who are supposed to help, and you know, they weren't able to access it or get the money they intended. And it's actually interesting now when we think about the Excluded Workers Fund and how that's going to get rolled out. I think there are a lot of big questions about that, and we'll be following that really closely too.
Follow the money. Isn't that the age-old advice? Thanks to
And
Watergate.
And for our audience members who aren't in New York, the Excluded Workers Fund is a fund that the state put into our budget this year to help undocumented immigrants and others who are left out of pandemic relief. So I do want to turn to Eddie and Crispina and get sort of the community side of these conversations. But before I go there, I said we would do this at the top, and I really do want to have this conversation. I mean, how has the last year of, you know, reckoning around racial justice and how we talk about systemic racism in this country, how has that affected newsrooms, and specifically newsrooms that cover immigration? And Mazen, you're such a great example because you founded a newsroom specifically to cover immigration, right? Obviously, I think in a place like, maybe without calling out names, places that aren't as hyper-focused may have different challenges.
Yeah, definitely. This was something that we thought about when we started the news organization, actually, that, you know, traditionally in big newsrooms, people get thrown into buckets, different communities get thrown into buckets, you know, Latinx people, immigration. Anytime you talk about Latinx, the first thing you think is immigration. You know, Black and brown people are thought about in the criminal justice context. It's always separated in that way. And we really wanted to kind of break that and make sure that we were showing the diversity first of immigration in the city, and how different immigrants are impacted by the immigration system based on their background. And we've done that, you know, through a number of different ways, just making sure that we're always trying to pick out stories, whether it be Muslims affected by the travel ban, or, you know, TPS holders who are affected by, you know, who are coming from Haiti or other places, Sudan as well. We've done stories about TPS holders from Sudan. And specifically in relation to how it affected the uprisings from last year, we published a piece from a great writer named Shamira on how Black immigrants in the city kind of face a double jeopardy through over-policing, and the history of NYPD police killings of Black immigrants. And a number of the largest cases of police shootings in the city the victims of those have been Black immigrants. So as a Black immigrant living in the city, you're often, you know, you're faced with these two issues where not only are you liable to be hit by stop and frisk and all the consequences that come with that, but getting arrested has all these other immigration consequences that now creates new problems for you. And Black immigrants are more likely to be faced by that. You know, Baji has done incredible work and research on this specific issue, and how, you know, the majority of Black immigrants are overrepresented in criminal-based immigration cases. And, you know, there's a lot of issues around the bills that the Biden administration is now pushing that have all of these criminal exceptions inside of them, and, you know, what that means for Black immigrants who are generally over-policed as well. So really trying to hit on that intersection has been really important for us. Now we're doing research into kind of mirroring the work that we're doing on WhatsApp for Caribbean immigrants, so non-Spanish speaking Caribbean immigrants. So we're in the process of doing a kind of what we call an info needs assessment in journalism, which basically just means like going out to the community and asking people, what information do you need in your life? Like, not what news, like what information is important to you? What is the places you're currently getting information, and finding out from immigrants from the Caribbean what those are, and trying to build a product that can help meet those needs. And so that we can just, you know, I think one thing that a lot of people want, and that I hear all the time, is that people want positive news as well about their community. People want to hear about the good things that happen in their community, and positive representations of Black immigrants in the news, and Black immigrants in the city. So trying to think through those issues has been really important to me over the past year, and maybe kind of checking some of my own personal kind of reflexes as a journalist to kind of what I consider to be a good story, and trying to think about what Black people actually want to see in the news, and how they want to be perceived and represented in the news. So that's what we've been working on at Documented. And I think the past year has really kind of accelerated that and made us focus on it more.
I would just add that in newsrooms right now, we really do have this intersection of racial justice, social justice, immigrant justice, DEI. All of these themes are about humanity and about championing individual rights, and not just typecasting one large group. So at Define American, we also want to show that Latinx is not, and the border is not all about immigration, and that our founder, Jose Antonio Vargas, had a visa overstay, and he's from the Philippines, but also that these organizations and these movements are all kind of coming together. Stop AAPI Hate is very much in line with immigrant justice. But I would say, in addition, if you're looking at diversity of coverage for journalism, I think we need to be exploring more about TPS and about Haiti, about Cameroon, about refugees from Africa and the Congo who are coming, and just to understand that immigration has so many different faces.
I was speaking to mute and voices, and I want to acknowledge and thank that Myra is actually translating all of this for Crispin right now, so that he can participate in this conversation. And this is our first time at IARC trying to do a bilingual panel, so we're definitely working on getting better. But and I want to say, Mazen, I really appreciate your comment about checking, you know, yourself and the decisions on the stories that you choose to tell. I mean, you know, I'm the white executive director of an immigrant rights organization, and it's something that I'm constantly trying to think through how we do. And I always talk about the similarities between immigration lawyers and journalists. In the past administration, we were like two of the most hated groups, and we have our dirty immigration lawyer t-shirts. I don't know if you have your equivalent, but yeah, it's
stained wretches.
Exactly. And I want to point in the chat to Chris Mercado's comment plus 1,000 times on Mazen's point on more joyful stories needed. We all need more joy right now. But those were really great answers. Thank you so much for sort of digging into this really difficult and charged topic. And I want to pivot a little bit. So Eddie, I'm just going to throw you in there and see if you have any response or comment to any of that. And just more broadly, if you can talk a little bit about, you know, as advocates, we see the real life impact that these policies have on our communities. And we just want to make sure that those stories get told. And what do we do? What do we have to do to make sure that they get told right and they get told well?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I do want to acknowledge a lot of what Mazen said, and I'm a huge fan of Documented in your newsletter. So for those folks here, do sign up. Very good. And also get joyful information about entrepreneurship, which I've seen lately. So thank you for that. I do want to acknowledge that, I believe that part of the journalist's job is not just identifying the issue, but also putting forth the solution. A lot of the times they report on issues that have already solutions, and that is left out of the narrative. And that keeps a lot of our community member, directly impacted people out of the loop. And what Mazen is saying in particular is like, how, which audience are you servicing and why? And I think we have to go and push our reporters a little harder on ensuring that the solutions are reported, right? And that are there. Not all the time, but I would say most of the times there is some type of information that it's missing because usually Black people, people of color are not the main audience member of that. And we follow all these, and particularly the big news papers, we follow them all, and they're just oblivion to that matter. And so that really spoke to me when I was thinking about the work that I do and how I interact with partners, community member, and directly impacted people. The other aspect that I do want to acknowledge and touch upon is, the whole racial justice, and particularly when it comes to Black immigrants. Even there's a lot of anti-Blackness that is not really spoken about, and I can speak specifically more with Latinx and Latino communities, where Black people that are Latinx exist, right? And we just tend to go with a dominant culture of, putting, and as Liz was saying, these like great stories of like people that follow all the rules per se, or have the opportunity to follow all the rules. And we forget about everyone else and everybody else's experience and just put it into the narrative of like Mexico and then a few other countries, right? But immigration is just much broader than that. It's so much complex and it's so nuanced. And I think that's part of the hard work that me as an advocate, I really try to be intentional about seeking out what those gaps are and being better about it, but also pushing my organizations to be better about it, right? Is we first have to identify the issue in order to try to fix it. And I wouldn't say I'm there as a person or even my organization is there, but every day that we wake up, we make a commitment to try to get there and to strive to see that perfection of, making sure that when we're telling and advocating for people, it's inclusive, that goes beyond my personal experience as a person who comes from immigrant parents and grandma was undocumented. That's a specific experience that comes from the Caribbean, right? That not necessarily translates to other people. And so that's just one thing I just want to point out, and just continuing to be innovative. The whole WhatsApp, it's huge among undocumented people, but in particularly immigrant communities. And the fact that information is being reached out through there is one of the ways that I would, not to complicate this a little bit, but that you also fight misinformation because you're meeting folks where they're at, right? You're giving them the information and empowering them, which is what I think storytelling is about. And so to sort of get to your question of how do we ensure that we forward.us and also the work that I do, we tell stories, putting people first. We are a very data and number driven organization. And one of the things that we try to do is making sure that those numbers have the humanity and the individuals that deserve the dignity of their stories to be told. We may not always get it right, but again, that's making sure that these folks are at the front of the data points, because without the human experiences, there's no number to advocate for or put forth. And so those are some of the ways that we really try to really focus on the humanity and the people story from across the state, but I would say nationally, because we are also a national organization. But I want to make sure that Crispin also has an opportunity to add on.
Yeah, and Crispin, if you have any perspectives on how we make sure that the community stories get told, and while he thinks about that, I also want to say we've got your questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much. Keep them coming. We'll get to them at the end. Myra, do you want to translate for Crispin?
Yeah, Can you just repeat the question again so I can?
Sure. How do we make sure that the community stories get told and the right stories get told in the right way?
Crispin, la pregunta para ti, para el panel del día de hoy es, ¿cómo nos aseguramos que las historias de la comunidad sean bien contadas, ¿no? En la prensa, comunique bien las historias de los inmigrantes. ¿Cómo nos podemos asegurar de que esas historias salgan correctas?
Sí, muchas gracias. Pues lo que queremos como más bien a trabajadores esenciales, ¿verdad? Más bien queremos realmente que nos reconozcan en este país, ¿verdad? Entonces, por ejemplo, estamos hablando de cómo nos afecta, ¿no? Lo que es el tema de inmigración en este país, pero realmente felicidades a todos los reporteros, ¿verdad? Hacen un trabajo tan importante, ¿verdad? Pero queremos que realmente cuenten nuestras historias, ¿verdad? Como lo que vivimos en nuestras comunidades. Y que realmente lleguen en las comunidades directamente afectadas, no solamente a la comunidad de inmigrantes, sino también a las comunidades refugiadas, ¿verdad? O refugiados. Hay muchos hermanos y hermanas que vienen en otros países y realmente muchos de ellos están aquí solamente para trabajar, ¿verdad? No hacer otra cosa, ¿verdad? Entonces, simplemente lo que queremos es que cuenten realmente nuestras historias y que seamos reconocidos más bien en este país trabajando como cualquier otro ciudadano.
Let me see if I can remember everything you say. Muchas gracias, Crispin. Well, Crispin is obviously like saying that he said that he thanks the press and the journalism for putting the stories of immigrants out there, but he really would like to see the press and the journalists to meet them where they are and to really tell the stories of the community, and not just the immigrant community, but the refugee community as well. And to be recognized as essential workers and as a worker in general, as a worker, as like a US citizen worker, because what they do here really it's a work like any of us do this point. So well, he, obviously appreciates that these stories are being told. He would like the press and the journalists to like meet them where they are, where they're working, and to really tell their stories.
Sí, yo siento que, por ejemplo, para que puedan contar nuestras historias realmente como son, tienen que más bien realmente trabajar con las comunidades directamente afectadas, ¿verdad? No solamente en la ciudad, sino en las comunidades rurales, ¿verdad? Donde viven y trabajan los trabajadores esenciales. Podemos darnos cuenta, estamos viviendo en una pandemia mundial y gracias a todos los trabajadores esenciales, ¿verdad? Por eso hay alimentos hoy en día, pero muchos han perdido su vida en el lugar de trabajo y otra de las cosas que estamos viviendo es por ejemplo, ¿verdad? Siempre con el miedo y el temor, ¿verdad? De los agentes de inmigración. Entonces, realmente lo que queremos es que cuenten las historias de nosotros, realmente más bien lo que estamos contribuyendo en este país y que tengamos una sociedad mejor para que seamos escuchados y reconocidos, pues, porque eso es lo que queremos, ¿verdad? Gracias.
He also would like to point out that we should tell the stories, not just the immigrant workers in the city of New York, but also the rural workers, all the workers that are in the farms and everything that have been providing us with food throughout this pandemic. And they are definitely the essential workers and the ones that have kept the economy of the state, and not only tell the stories cover the stories of the immigrants in the city, but also those who have been working in the farms, in the rural areas, providing us with all the resources that we've had throughout this pandemic. They are the ones that have been going out there, even with fear of being, picked by ICE. But they've been going to work through this entire pandemic to provide all of us with the resources and all the essentials.
Sí, algo muy importante es que no es porque apenas se está viviendo eso, sino siempre se ha vivido y es algo muy importante, ¿verdad? De que cuentan realmente la realidad, lo que viven nosotros, más bien personas directamente afectadas en nuestras comunidades. Y cómo darnos cuenta, ¿verdad? Cómo viven las personas directamente afectadas o las personas que sufren realmente de esta situación. Un ejemplo, ¿verdad? Si hay un reportero, me llama o nos contactan desde la ciudad de Nueva York que quiere describir nuestras historias y pues la razón de identificar más bien las historias de las personas, tienen que hacer todo lo posible de acudir a donde están las comunidades, ¿verdad? Y contar las historias, no solamente lo que estamos viviendo en la sociedad, sino también principalmente hay muchas cosas que pasan, pero en general, ¿verdad? Estamos hablando, por ejemplo, también de condiciones en el lugar de trabajo. Entonces, hay muchos, más bien hay trabajadores que realmente, ¿verdad? Incluso hasta trabajan lo que es diariamente en este país y llegan a perder sus vidas. Entonces, eso es lo que realmente queremos que salga al público y básicamente lo que estamos pidiendo es que reconozcan nuestro trabajo, la contribución que estamos haciendo a este país y eso es lo que queremos, incluso hasta si es posible que haya una reforma migratoria para proteger a todos los trabajadores esenciales, ¿verdad? Y gracias a ellos tenemos alimento hoy en día. Muchas gracias.
He also wants to add that this is not this is not new. This is not new. Like, it's not just through the pandemic that they've been providing for us, and that this is happening. It's always been this case, and many workers have lost their lives because they are putting long hours to work to provide for everything. And all he would like to see is a recognition of all the contributions that the workers give to the country, and so an immigration reform would be a way to recognize the work that they do every day for long hours. And again, it's not new. He also wanted to say that if, for example, he is being contacted by a journalist from the city to do a report, he would like to see that journalist, meet them with where he is to really get to know what the workers are going through, the conditions that the workers are going through, the conditions that they work at in the farms, etc. So just, to go up there and to really see where they work and not just write, a story. And so I think I captured most of it. Gracias, Crispin. Muchísimas gracias, Crispin.
Thank you. Eddie, I think you had something you wanted to add too.
Well, yeah, I do want to just very quickly point out to that last section that Crispin was talking about, because as someone who works with directly impacted people, advocates, and journalists, right, there's a lot of time when they come to us, journalists come wanting to seek a quote or story or more context and understanding, but there's a lack of relationship building there. And that comes across lack of care. And you can see it in some of the articles where it's just the bottom line is to get a quote, to have a different point of view. And I think that's hurtful and it's difficult, but I think that starts in the newsrooms, right? We have to make sure that we are pushing reporters to put out what are the nuances and how to build relationship, how to make sure that we do that. And we know that they do it all the time in other topics, right? They do that in the political world, they do that even when covering crimes, right? You have to have that relationship. And that's something that's missing, in particular with folks that live in rural areas. And so for us, we come in and we try to, build those relationships, because we know that at the end of the day, we want to get the story published, and we're trying to figure out what is the most humane possible way that story can be told to be effective in order to, do X policy and move that forward. The one example I want to touch upon back on the news stories of how, reporters can actually hint in on the problem and also cover the solution is on the Excluded Workers Fund. While the guidance hasn't been given, when it passed, there was a lot of community members that were very lost as to what this meant to them and how do they figure it out. And so I remember the city, which again, support your local news, newsroom and newspaper, they wrote this extensive article of what excluded worker was, what it meant, and what the information they had available now, so that people can actually, have the pathway and the guidance to do that research themselves. And not just research, but also have the underlying solutions as to when they can expect, et cetera. These are things we've seen in other topics, but when it comes to immigration, there's a lack of that. And so I just wanted to make sure that I point out that there are reporters there, like Liz Malzahn and the city, who are putting this forward. But I would love to see that a little more, because that goes into not just the acknowledgement that Crispin is talking about, but the humanization of the individuals and communities.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. I know, Liz, you have something you want to add. I just want to uplift something that Eddie said earlier that I think is so important, which is that a lot of times, you see these stories and you think, wow, you've just discovered something new, and you don't see the work that went behind it. And a really great example actually was that whole nail salon story, that series of articles that came out a few years ago that led to a huge rate. It was a huge expose on the labor conditions in nail salons in New York City. It led to Governor Cuomo, the New York governor, creating a task force for exploited workers. I mean, the repercussions were massive and welcome. But the reality was that you had advocates who've been working on this issue for years, the Domestic Workers Alliance and others, who, ADICAR, the small women-led group of Nepali women in Woodside, Queens, who had been trying to raise the profile of these issues and the exploitation that these nail salon workers were living through for a very long time. And to see it sort of play out in the press as here we are writing an expose, which was 100% accurate, but did not in any way, shape, or form acknowledge the work, the years of work that advocates from those communities themselves had put in, and in this particular case, for this incredible group of women called ADICAR, who come from a society where women are not supposed to speak to start with. So they were just breaking barriers left and right, and they really were the ones who finally broke through and managed to get the profile. And I think that I just wanted to really highlight that example, because as you were speaking, it came back to me in a very powerful way. Liz, I'm sorry I interrupted you though.
Yeah, no, Eddie, I think you bring up something that's really critical right now in journalism, and that is relationships and listening. So much of what we do as reporters is not only ask questions and get that quick answer, but it's to listen. And that's what I'm trying to do at Define American, much like you do at Forward US, and just trying to establish that relationship for younger journalists, for established journalists, to have an interplay. Here's where we are coming from, here are the facts. But there isn't a lot of time in journalism to listen. And there is this push, of course, you got to post something that is clickbait, and you have to make sure that your headlines say surge of migrants at the border and crisis to bring in all of this. And I think now is really a good time to reevaluate in journalism. And maybe Mazen, you'd agree with me, because so many local journalists are losing their jobs. And you're getting very large mainstream media, but also nonprofit newsrooms. And they're trying to have a new model. Newsrooms are trying to have a new model of including people and quoting the right people. So I do think it's the perfect time to have these conversations. And what you're saying about listening, we need to do that. We need to have nuance. And if only we can get editors, hopefully you're on this, to listen to that. and younger reporters to say, okay, I don't have to write a story that is all negative, but I can highlight what is happening that could be a solution. So maybe Mazen, you want to jump in here, that this moment, there is a moment for this type of work in journalism.
Absolutely, yeah. It is hard. Like I could get really deep in the weeds and talk about how the business model, kind of encourages that type of journalism. And like, I feel for reporters. I've been that reporter who just called someone on deadline and was like, yo, help me. I need this information right now. And you want people that have more sustained approach. Like, I really respected what Crispin said about, you want somebody to show up there. We've done stories about the amazing work that Crispin has done. And, we've had reporters actually go and spend time with farm workers and talk about the issues that they were facing and the right to unionize and all these different things. And the stories are just so much better and so much stronger. And it takes time and it takes investment. And I think that we are definitely at a moment now where, younger reporters have that in them, that they want to do that type of journalism, they prefer to do that type of journalism, and that hopefully we can kind of see a sea change in the industry for that reason. But I think it is going to take time before we do that, just because newsrooms are under this kind of economic collapse at the moment. Like you've seen what's happened to the Daily News over the past 10 years. I think they're going to get bought by a hedge fund soon. And, the New York Post as well, like, not typically outlets that are, maybe politically aligned with some of the groups here, but they, the reporters that work there, they're under intense pressure and they're having to cover a lot more with a lot less time. And for that reason, I think that it is going to take some time before we see a genuine culture shift in news. But I think people are starting to realize that it's actually more detrimental to try and do things in this kind of quick turnaround way. But we'll see what happens. And to jump off what you said about solutions, Eddie, I think is so important. And I think that really the big conversation in news right now is like, who are we trying to reach? And if you're talking about a problem that Black people know is a problem, and you're talking about it as though it's like this thing that just is just occurring, then clearly you're not talking to Black people, So if you really want to do that, if you're committed, as a lot of news organizations say they are, to reaching diverse audiences, then you actually have to be willing to really kind of fundamentally change the way you're thinking about your work. There's a lot of times in articles where you explain certain things like a term or a policy, but maybe you don't explain other things. So sometimes they'll throw in like a slang term, and the New York Times will come up and they'll explain it. So clearly we know who you're speaking to when you do that. So kind of really thinking about, okay, if I really want to reach these audiences and I really want to feel like I'm of these communities, then you really have to change what you're doing and start thinking about, okay, like what does it actually mean to be in service to these communities? And it will change so much, but I think we're a long way off from that.
I think I have a question, actually, if I may, to Liz and Mazen. So I think one thing that could be helpful for folks here in Advocates is, what are some of the best things and how can folks best prepared when they're talking to journalists? Because the other thing we do this at Forward, where we media train and prep our storytellers, but you don't always have time, and sometimes you're working with partners who and resources are limited in training, et cetera. And so what are some of the best steps that in sort of best practices that advocates and directly impacted people, when talking to a journalist, can use to make sure that they're getting their story in whatever article that you folks are putting out?
I'll go very quickly on that, but that's great. I mean, we would like to have as much experience and knowledge on this, which is why I usually start with lawyers. And the lawyers sometimes stay with me and say, no, you can't say that, you can't say that. But I think the real issue is attribution that we've dealt with, especially during the Trump administration, with such fear, and that fear still exists, of deportation. So the issue as a journalist, and especially at the New York Times, was not using anonymous sources, and certainly not changing a name if you can all help it, because we want to make sure that that information is accurate. But when you speak to somebody, to be, I would tell the source to say, wait a second, how are you using this? Or I'd like to be called by this pronoun and also by my middle name or by a nickname. And journalists always have to say why, and it's usually for fear of deportation or because the legal process is ensuing or there is a court. So that's the first thing. But also, journalists need to be very sensitive that asking people to re-traumatize themselves in telling a story is not something that will always be forthcoming. I've had interviews that were shut down. I've also had interviews where the person went and talked for 2 hours because it was therapeutic. Just tell the person who is a source as well as a journalist, as I would say, listen and observe the cues.
Yeah, definitely. For like advocates and lawyers who are like trying to actually get stories placed and really kind of struggling to approach journalists, I would say, you know, like take your advice about what journalists should do and like flip it, like take the first step and build the relationship with reporters. You know, think about who you read locally that you like, and you know, read the byline. Like a lot of people don't read bylines, so like read the byline, find that, go to that page or that journalist author page, see what else they publish, and be like, okay, like then you can kind of get a sense, this is the type of stories this person's after, and the work that I'm doing would probably be a good fit for them. And then just don't hit them up for a story the first time. Just message them and say, I really like your work. This is the kind of work that I do. I'd love to connect. You know, could we hop on as, you know, not a coffee these days, like a Zoom call or a call, and just have a conversation with them, ask them what kind of stories they do, what kind of things their outlet is looking for, and you know, what's on their radar. And then, you know, even if you already know this information, just ask them anyway. And then next time when you have a pitch or something like that, that reporter is going to give it a second look. They're not just going to ignore it in their inbox. They're going to at least reply to you and be like, you know, not this one, but next time. And don't be afraid to say, why not? Like, well, what is it about this story? They might hit you with the classic, oh, my editor, I would love to do it, but my editor won't let me do it, which is like, you know, it's a tried and true. And sometimes it's true, but sometimes it's just like, you don't want to answer the question. But don't take it personally, just keep it moving and like try again. And at the end of the day, like if you're a reporter, especially if you're working at a big news outlet, your editor is on your back to produce stories. So you're always looking for stories. So if you can make that a bit easier, the reporters will be more than happy. So like, I think there's this kind of crazy problem, me and Camila spoken about it, where like, you know, there's all these young reporters who don't know, who really want sources and don't know how to reach people. And then there are all these advocates with these incredible stories who don't know how to reach journalists. And it's just about like, you know, both of us just need to be better communicators and like kind of speak to each other in our own language.
I'll add the part that Mazen's not saying, which is that then you get the relationship to a point where it's like, I call Liz or Mazen just like saying something crazy. They're like, yeah, no, thanks. Bye, Camille. Not today. But sometimes it's stick. I mean, we've done some really great storytelling together too. Crispin, I would love to know if you have anything you want to add to this conversation. And then we do have some great questions I want to get to.
Sí, yo lo que quiero añadir es de que todas las personas que nos están viendo o en nuestras comunidades donde estamos viviendo, es muy importante cuando están viendo a personas de color, ya no solo personas que vienen de Centroamérica, pero también otros países, ya sea a refugiados o refugiadas, es importante que estén en solidaridad con nosotros para apoyar, ¿verdad? Lo que está pasando en la comunidad y en general, ¿verdad? Que ellos nos ayuden a crear leyes justas para proteger a a las comunidades donde estamos y si queremos leyes justas, entonces que nos ayuden a, por ejemplo, votar, ¿verdad? Que tengamos leyes justas. Estamos hablando en Nueva York, ¿verdad? Entonces, ¿por qué menciono eso? Porque es muy importante, ¿verdad? Porque hay muchos trabajadores que vienen en otro país como nosotros, no podemos votar. Entonces, eso es muy importante, ¿verdad? Que estén siempre en solidaridad con nosotros y eso es para crear conciencia en la comunidad y también crear leyes justas para que protegen a todas las personas y básicamente es nuestros derechos como humanos, ¿verdad? Muchas gracias.
So to close in closing, Crispin just wanted to add that for those who are watching right now, it's sort of like a call to action. If you want to support in the work of the immigrant community, he's calling everybody to, you know, vote for policies that will help the community, vote for policies that will protect the community, and recognize the benefits of the communities, the immigrant community, the refugee communities, to help us get there, to help us get the recognition that the immigrant community deserves through our votes.
Thank you. We do have some great questions in the Q&A. I think in the chat they've been mainly answered. So I'll go to the Q&A really quickly and try to summarize. And if anybody has any other questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So there's a larger question from Karina about stateless communities and how about stateless communities in the US and how you get those stories to be told. And I'm assuming based on this message, Karina, that you work for an organization that works with the stateless. And Mazen or Liz, I think you've already sort of answered how you go about a pitch. I don't know if maybe in the page that we set up on our website after this, we can put the emails that your organizations use for pitches, how to contact the newsrooms. I don't want to just put your personal contact information in the chat, but I think we've kind of covered that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
I just think it's important to include, and thank you, Karina, for that. Just we talk about nationalities and we don't have enough discussion of those who are stateless. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear more about that. Please do reach out to us about it.
And great. And can newsrooms do anything to flip the conversation from forcing immigrants to prove their worth to be here to putting anti-immigration advocates' feet to the fire to defend their positions? When will it be standard practice in newsrooms to ask anti-immigration advocates to tell their families' immigration stories and explain why they think the rules should be applied differently now, or why the US is justified in committing human rights abuses against immigrants and immigrants' communities?
Wow.
Yeah, this is such a great question. So yeah, I can start off, Liz, if that's all right. This is something we thought about a lot when we started Documented. It was like a lot of, because we're a nonprofit, you know, a lot of journalism focused nonprofit funders were asking us, you know, what about the anti-immigrant side? Like, what about the anti-immigration narrative? Like, how can we talk about that? Why don't we talk about that? Why aren't you quoting them? And it just created this really strange paradigm where it was like, how do you talk to, you know, that community, let's say, without propagating misinformation and kind of elevating racist narratives? So the New York Times, I think throughout the Trump administrations and the Washington Post actually attempted to do kind of what you're talking about. And there was fierce backlash and justified backlash in a lot of ways, because what kind of profiling a lot of the people that you were mentioning ended up doing was kind of slipping in a lot of really, you know, false anti-immigrant narratives and racist anti-immigrant narratives that, in a sense, sanitized and normalized them. So how do we kind of approach this issue and hold these, you know, anti-immigrant, you know, like false anti-immigrant institutions, Center for Immigration Studies? There's a lot of white nationalists that work there. people who published on white supremacist websites, who also policy writers at Center for Immigration Studies. How do you approach that organization that is basically setting the agenda for the American immigration policy without doing that? And to be honest, I haven't found the answer. And like, if people have ideas about how journalists can do that better, there are a lot of journalists that are thinking about this very issue, and they're genuinely really grappling with it. Because you're right, we don't want this to be a situation where, all we're doing is talking about this through this kind of the downtrodden immigrants, they're suffering under this policy and another policy. We actually want to interrogate and push, a lot of the false misinformation that's being pushed. And, I heard a really great talk from a former Center Customs and Border Protections official who was basically saying that their problem was that, a lot of the prevailing academics that are working in the anti-immigration space, most of their theories have been completely disproven scientifically, in terms of immigrants are more likely to commit crime, immigrants are more likely immigrants don't contribute to the economy, things of that nature. So what you were left with was just really a feeling, people just feel like their country is changing and they don't like it. So what do you do with that? Because that effectively is just xenophobia and racism. How do you deal with that as a journalist and write about it in a way that doesn't add to the problem? And I've not yet seen a really good example of it. And I'd really, really happy to talk about it more, because it's just something that we're really struggling with.
I could add briefly, if that's okay.
Yeah. I was going to give a time check, but go for it.
Don't quote members of the Tanton network that is funded, this whole network. You said CIS, Numbers USA. So be very careful, because what they're saying, and a lot of them went into the Trump administration. It's this obligation of both sides that I do agree that when I was at the Times, we definitely had that. Well, you got to get the other side. They're not the other side. Who could be the other side? Former administration officials, again, unless it's Stephen Miller, perhaps going back to get more of a perspective. Find somebody from a community, find a professor who has done research, find a trade organization that has a perspective if you're doing a labor story. So don't go to that crutch. And I'm hoping that journalists see that for what it was during the Trump administration.
Yeah, I know we are.
No, go for it.
Yeah, it just from an advocate perspective, and someone who in an organization who counters a lot of those terrible false narratives from these organizations you mentioned, I can't agree more with Liz. Don't quote them. They're not legitimate. And when you're and there should be no reason, but when you are this is when people should be given the context as who they are, who's founded them, and what do they stand for, right? Because that's the other thing. It's just they're quoting by, Numbers USA, right? For instance. And that's it. And so people who are not in the day-to-day take it as just facts. And are able to decipher that. And so as someone who works to counter those narratives, but also works with people, it's just do not quote them in any kind of way. And when they are mentioned, mention the backstory as to what they are and the delegitimization that they represent and what they're trying to do, which is not a I don't want to just say don't cover conservative, but that goes beyond conservative. That's just
nativist.
Yeah, and the hatred of other, and the destruction of someone's humanity, which can get us into a slippery slope, which we've seen before. But I'll end there.
Thank you. So we are at 1 minute past the hour. I wanted to end it with the last question, which came in first, but I purposely left for last because I thought it would be a nice thing to end on, which is, Mazen, can you expand more on the project on the information community wants? It sounds super interesting, and I want to add, it sounded very some good news network type-ish. So maybe that was me projecting. Yeah. I don't know, but I might be a good one to end on.
Yeah, I'll just say super quickly. So there's a lot of organizations, you can look them up, the Listening Post Collective, Outlier Media in Detroit, they do this type of work. There are a few others as well, that basically what they'll do is go and ask the community what information they need or want. Internews runs the Listen Post Collective. So they'll, after a natural disaster, go out, find the information that people need and create information and news based on what people say they actually want and need. And, where people of other organizations like ours and across the country are basically now applying this to be the formation of how you actually create a beat that serves a community. So you don't just sit there in a room with a bunch of journalists and editors and think about like, yeah, this sounds like a good story, like we should do this. You go, you survey, you ask the community what they want, you ask the community how they get their information, and you build your news vertical or product around it. That's how we came up with the WhatsApp news service, and that's how we're hoping to come up with this service. And one of the things that's coming out of the surveys is people want more good news. They don't want to just hear about the latest horrible policy. People want to hear about people in their community doing well. So we're going to try and incorporate that.
I will tell you that from the lawyer's perspective, you will have many, many readers there. We also want to hear all the good stories. Well, I want to thank you all so much. I've been wanting to do this panel forever. It's such an important, critical conversation. I'm so happy that we were able to have it with all of you. I want to give a really special thanks to Crispin for hanging in there with us and for helping us inaugurate our very first bilingual, but not the last bilingual panel here at IARC. We are an organization dedicated to increasing access to justice for immigrants, but we think that part of that is to make sure that we're having a better conversation on immigration, and that starts by all of us working together to make sure that happens. So thank you all so much. We'll be posting the video of this event along with the additional resources that may come along on our website, and we look forward to seeing you very soon for more conversations on immigration. Thank you so much.